The war swarm had never been born. It had been assembled, layer by layer, in a forgotten conflict so old that most cadets in the Galactic Academy thought it was a myth told by bored instructors. Yet the weapon existed, and it did not care about myths or medals or politics. It cared only about input and response, movement and annihilation. In the low orbit of a blue-white star, deep inside the Academy's black-ringed testing facility, the swarm slept inside a containment sphere that hummed with a dozen redundant fail-safes. Entire civilizations had tried to dismantle it. Entire civilizations had given up. On the observation deck, the cadets stood pressed against the transglass barrier, watching the containment hang in the center of the arena below. The chamber itself was a hollow cylinder many levels deep, lined with absorber panels and scarred plates. Scorch marks painted the walls like fossilized lightning. Deep grooves cut through the floor where previous trials had gone wrong. Every mark was a signature, a reminder. This is what happens when the war swarm wakes up. The instructors did not rush to explain. Silence was part of the lesson. 100 species stood side by side, some with chitin armor, some with fur, some wrapped in pressure suits. Heartbeats, clicks, rustling scales, and whispered translations blended into a nervous background drone. The younger cadets had never seen the swarm active. The older ones had, and those cadets watched the sphere with the same tight, wary focus of someone staring at an open flame while holding fuel. At the center of the observation deck, perched on a raised platform, stood Commander Varkle, a broad-shouldered reptilian veteran whose scales had long ago faded from bright emerald to battle-worn gray. He had survived 3 wars, 2 mutinies, and 1 failed assassination by his own students. The only thing that still unsettled him was the war swarm. His slit-pupiled eyes never left the containment sphere. "Look at it," he said at last. His voice carried through translators and neural links into a dozen languages at once. "This is what the old empires built when reason failed. A machine that learns only one lesson. Everything is a target." The cadets shifted uneasily. Some adjusted their armor, as if that would matter. Others clutched training weapons with hands, claws, or tendrils. One of the younger cadets, a thin avian boy with bright metallic feathers, raised a trembling hand. "Sir, is it true no one has ever commanded it? Not even for a moment?" Commander Varkle did not answer immediately. He let the question hang there, like dust motes drifting in the artificial gravity. The cadets watched him, waiting for the comforting lie that every academy in the galaxy loved so much, that the instructors knew what they were doing, that everything had a plan, that no test would be allowed if the outcome was truly uncertain. "Yes," Varkle said at last. "It is true. No one has commanded it. No one has even slowed it without brute force." He pointed a talon toward the scars in the arena below. "What you see down there is not from training weapons. That is from the emergency overrides. When the swarm slips the leash, the arena fires on its own equipment to stop it." A murmur passed through the group. Even the most arrogant cadets fell quiet. It was one thing to face simulated danger, to know deep down that an instructor would step in. It was another thing entirely to realize the academy itself had to defend against its own test. The war swarm floated in its containment like a dark, shimmering mist. At this distance, it looked almost beautiful. Individual micro-drones were impossible to see with the naked eye, but the way light bent around the cloud made it shimmer with false depth, like a miniature singularity caught in glass. Occasionally, the swarm rippled, forming a vague shape, a spike, a claw, a web of threads, before relaxing again. "Why do we keep it?" another cadet asked. This one had a voice like a grinding stone, filtered through a respirator. "If it is this dangerous, why not dismantle it atom by atom?" Commander Varkle's jaw clenched. The question had been asked many times before, in many variations. "Because the galaxy is filled with those who do not fear their own creations," he said. "We train you to face what you cannot negotiate with. You will meet species that treat weapons like toys. You will meet factions that will happily unleash something like this on a civilian world. If you are lucky, you will face this thing in a controlled arena first." He paused, then added in a lower voice, "And because we cannot dismantle it, the swarm rebuilds itself. Cut it down to a single micro-drone, and it will cannibalize whatever matter it finds until it is whole again. We can only cage it, redirect it, or destroy the matter it feeds on faster than it can consume." That thought landed like a weight in the cadets' stomachs. Somewhere among the crowd, someone whispered a quick prayer. Somewhere else, another cadet quietly vomited into a waste receptacle. No one laughed. The test, officially, was simple. Survive 10 minutes in the arena with the swarm. No personal drones, no heavy mech suits, no orbital bombardment. Only passive shields and basic tools were allowed. The instructors monitored the field from a control booth lined with kill switches and fail-safes. The war swarm had been bound with invisible walls of containment fields, layer on layer, but everyone in the room knew nothing was perfect. The swarm had a way of finding flaws. That was part of its design. The first time the Academy had used the swarm, centuries ago, an entire graduating class had refused to enter the arena. The administration almost banned the test. Then 3 admirals and a planetary governor argued that a cadet who would never face true terror was worse than a cadet who died trying. The debate lasted a year. The swarm waited patiently in its sphere, humming to itself in minuscule vibrations, blind, deaf, and yet somehow alert. In the end, the admirals won. The test stayed. The stories spread. Now, the war swarm trial was a rite of passage whispered about in dorm corridors long after lights out. Cadets traded rumors the way smugglers traded contraband. Some stories said the swarm could sense fear hormones in the air. Others insisted it could recognize lies or track heartbeats. No one knew how much was true and how much was the product of exhausted imaginations. Commander Varkle had been a cadet once. He remembered his own trial with the swarm in vivid detail. The moment the containment dropped, the air had gone wrong, like static crawling under his scales. The swarm had poured toward him as a living storm of glittering dust. He had survived by diving inside a collapsed maintenance tunnel and sealing himself in with emergency foam, listening to the microscopic razors scrape at the barrier until the timer finally ended. He had not slept soundly for a month afterward. He had not told any of his students that part. "Today," Varkle said, "you will not be inside the arena. You will observe. Consider this a mercy. Only the top-ranked combat group will face the swarm this cycle. The rest of you will study every second of it. You will learn from their mistakes. You will imagine what you would do differently." A large screen flickered to life above the observation deck, showing different angles of the empty arena. The containment sphere hovered above the center platform, sheaths of energy around it glowing faintly blue. Status readouts scrolled along the sides: energy output, swarm density, containment integrity. Numbers that looked reassuring if one did not understand how quickly they could change. The cadets jostled for better viewing angles. A few taller species stepped politely aside so shorter ones could see. An insectoid girl with emerald eyes clung to the railing, mandibles clicking softly as she studied the sphere. Beside her, a massive, four-armed brute from a high-gravity world crossed his arms over his chest and pretended indifference. His secondary hands shook. "What happens if the containment fails while the test runs?" the insectoid girl asked. "We terminate the trial," Varkle said. "Emergency fields will cut off the arena from the rest of the station. Backup incineration protocols activate. The swarm hates heat, so we drown it in fire until nothing is left but plasma and regret." "Does that always work?" she asked. Varkle's silence was answer enough. The girl's antennae drooped. No one had ever tamed the war swarm. The archives contained countless experiments, psionic specialists attempting to overwhelm its distributed intelligence, quantum engineers trying to insert command routines into its collective behavior, cults who believed the swarm's perfect obedience to simple parameters was a form of purity and tried to join it. All had failed. The swarm obeyed its base code: seek, evaluate, dismantle, consume. It responded to motion, contrast, and threat signatures. Attempts to graft more complex priorities onto it always ended in catastrophe. At best, the swarm ignored the new commands. At worst, it interpreted them in ways that turned entire test stations into floating scrap. The Academy's rules were clear. No one was permitted to attempt control. The trial was survival, not dominion. Yet, in every generation, there were always a few cadets who whispered in quiet corners that they wanted to be the one, the first handler, the master of the untamable weapon. Ambition, Varkle knew, was harder to cage than any swarm. He watched the faces around him: fear, awe, bravado. A few wore the blank expressions of those who had decided already that if the swarm came for them, they would stand and fight instead of running. He respected the courage. He doubted the outcome. A chime sounded through the deck, a bright, clear note that cut through the tension. "Attention," an automated voice announced. "War swarm trial commencing. Combat Group Alpha, report to staging airlock." Screens flickered as cameras switched to show the staging area. A handful of cadets stood in a pressurized chamber, suited in light armor and carrying only the allowed equipment: rope, shield generators, sensor beacons, manual tools. No drones, no smart weapons, nothing that could be hijacked by a weapon designed to dissect technology itself. Varkle glanced briefly at the roster, confirming names out of habit, then returned his attention to the arena. He knew almost every cadet in that group by face and by file. He knew which ones froze under pressure and which ones made reckless decisions. He could predict, with unpleasant accuracy, who would attempt something heroic and who would survive by hiding under debris. He had run this trial enough times to understand that clever plans lasted about 3 seconds after the containment dropped. He folded his hands behind his back and exhaled slowly. The Academy called this a test of courage. Varkle thought of it as a negotiation between mortality and arrogance. The war swarm was the one participant that never compromised. The deck lights dimmed slightly. Energy readings on the screen climbed as containment protocols shifted from static storage to active trial mode. The sphere glowed brighter, the humming intensifying. The swarm stirred inside like a storm front trapped behind glass. "Watch closely," Varkle told the cadets around him. "This is the galaxy's worst idea, preserved so you can understand what it means to face a threat that does not listen, does not fear, and does not stop. Remember every instinct you feel right now. One day, that instinct may be the only thing between you and vacuum." Below, unseen behind reinforced doors, Combat Group Alpha stepped into the lift that would carry the team down into the arena. The swarm waited, patient and hungry in its cage of light. The test had not even begun, yet the weight of it pressed down on every heart in the observation deck. No one in that room, not even Commander Varkle with his decades of experience, could imagine that somewhere out in the wider galaxy, a human with a cheap little pointer in her pocket was already on her way to the Academy, ready to look at this ancient terror and say, with complete sincerity, "Has anyone tried treating it like a bored pet?" Rhea arrived at the Galactic Academy without ceremony, without escort, and without the slightest understanding of why every species she passed stared at her as if she had wandered into a restricted zone by accident. The shuttle's ramp descended with a hiss of air, and she stepped out carrying one duffel bag slung over her shoulder and a small cylindrical case hooked to her belt. She wore practical travel clothes, her hair tied back in a simple knot, and her expression carried that familiar human blend of readiness and mild curiosity. The Academy expected cadets who marched with rigid posture or radiated a ceremonial aura. Rhea looked more like someone checking into a hostel because the nearest city had run out of rooms. Security scanners swept over her as she walked through the arrival corridor. A serpentine officer coiled behind a hollow terminal blinked in surprise at the readings. No explosives, no forbidden nanotech, no unauthorized augmentations. Almost nothing suspicious at all. His eyes lingered on the small metal cylinder hanging from her belt. It was too insignificant to trigger an alert, but unusual enough to note. "Purpose of visit?" he asked, expecting a longer explanation. Rhea smiled politely. "Enrollment. The Academy accepted my application 2 cycles ago. I'm supposed to check in for evaluation week." The officer rechecked the registry, found her name, and then studied her for several seconds. She did not flinch or fidget. She simply waited, hands resting loosely against her bag straps. "You are very late," he said at last. "Evaluation week began 2 days ago." "I know. My transport got diverted," she said with an apologetic shrug. "Something about a micro-singularity forming too close to the trade route. Traffic backed up for hours." The officer blinked again. Most cadets panicked at the idea of a micro-singularity anywhere near their ship. Rhea sounded as if she had been stuck in rush-hour congestion. He cleared her through without further comment. The moment she stepped into the main atrium, she realized the academy was far larger than she had imagined. Spiraling walkways twisted around transparent columns filled with drifting holograms. Anti-grav platforms carried groups of cadets upward in coordinated lifts. A faint hum vibrated through the air, the pulse of thousands of devices operating simultaneously. Rhea stopped to watch a group of insectoid students practicing movement drills, their synchronized leaps forming shimmering patterns. Her face lit up with fascination. She rummaged through her bag as if wanting to sketch them, hesitated, then continued walking. Everywhere she went, she felt eyes on her. Some curious, some confused, some faintly concerned. Humans were rare in the Academy's elite division. Most who arrived carried experimental gear, neural link visors, or bulky equipment that suggested a readiness for anything. Rhea carried none of that. She carried something closer to the human version of travel snacks and pocket tools. Her dorm assignment appeared on her wrist console, and she followed the pulsing arrow through several interconnected corridors. As she walked, she passed clusters of cadets whispering in low tones. Snippets of speech drifted past her. "The War Swarm trial is today. Commander Varkle supervising personally. Alpha team is already in the arena prep." Rhea slowed slightly. She had heard of the War Swarm in the same vague, myth-tinted way humans heard of deep-sea leviathans or failed military AIs. Dangerous, yes, but distant and abstract. Something instructors used as a cautionary tale. She turned a corner and nearly collided with a towering mammalian cadet whose fur bristled at the edges. He stepped back quickly, then froze when he recognized her species. "You should not be here," he said, voice deep and oddly gentle. "The observation deck is at capacity. Your group should have checked in hours ago." "Oh, I'm not going to the observation deck," she said. "I'm looking for Commander Varkle. I need to confirm my arrival before the evaluation schedule advances." The big cadet stared at her, confused and a little horrified. "Commander Varkle is overseeing the War Swarm trial. No one interrupts him." "Then I guess I'll have to wait outside," she said with an easy grin. "Thanks for the warning." She walked past him, leaving the cadet staring after her as if she had calmly announced her intention to swim through an active plasma conduit. The closer she came to the restricted testing zone, the more the corridors shifted from soft ambient light to sharp utilitarian lines. Reinforced walls replaced decorative panels. The air cooled. Warning stripes marked every sealed doorway. Rhea followed her console map until she reached a checkpoint guarded by 2 armed officers. They turned toward her immediately. "This area is restricted during trials," one said. His armor glinted under the sterile lights. "Authorized personnel only." "I'm trying to report to Commander Varkle," she said. "My transport was delayed and—" "You cannot report now," the second guard interrupted. "Commander Varkle is engaged. Return to the cadet dormitory and await—" A sudden vibration rippled through the floor. An alarm flared briefly, then hushed. The guards snapped alert and checked their monitors. The War Swarm trial was beginning. Rhea looked past them. A heavy blast door stood sealed, a faint pulsating symbol glowing across its surface. She could not see the arena, but she could feel tension in the air, a certain crispness that reminded her of the time she had visited an advanced robotics lab on Earth. Machines in a resting state carried a distinct hum. Machines preparing to act carried a different one. "Is that the swarm?" she asked quietly. The guards exchanged a look. Most cadets avoided even mentioning the swarm near the testing zone. Her tone held only curiosity. "Yes," the first guard said. "The containment shift has begun. It is best not to linger in this section during an active trial." Rhea nodded appreciatively. "Understood. Could one of you send a notice to Commander Varkle that Cadet Rhea Benson—" Another tremor shook the hallway. This time it carried a sharper resonance, like countless metal grains brushing together. One guard stiffened. "That is inside safe parameters," he said quickly, more to himself than to her. Rhea's eyes brightened. "Does it always sound like that?" The guards did not answer. One subtly stepped in front of her, as if shielding her from danger she did not seem to notice. The other prepared to escort her away. Before they could insist, an officer in a pale uniform approached rapidly from the inner corridor. She carried a datapad and looked as though she had not slept in several cycles. When she saw Rhea, she frowned in confusion. "Are you the human transfer?" she asked. "Yes," Rhea said with a warm smile. "That's me. You were supposed to arrive 2 days ago." "I tried. Space disagreed." The officer sighed and rubbed her temple. "Commander Varkle requested all late arrivers be brought directly to the observation deck for orientation. Since you are already in the restricted wing, you may as well follow me. Stay close. Do not wander. Do not touch anything." Rhea nodded obediently and followed. They passed through 2 more checkpoints and descended a spiral ramp that wrapped around a directed energy chamber. The deeper they walked, the stronger the hum of the war swarm became. Rhea listened intently, tilting her head slightly, her footsteps unhurried. The officer kept glancing back at her, as if expecting her to break into a sprint in the opposite direction. At last, they reached a door carved into the curved wall. The officer placed her hand on the scanner, and the door slid open. Noise burst through at once, terrified shouts, urgent commands, the muffled roar of layered containment fields adjusting to sudden strain. The observation deck stretched ahead, illuminated by harsh overhead lights. Rows of cadets crowded the transglass barrier. Some shouted warnings, some covered their mouths, others stared in stunned silence. On the central screen, Combat Group Alpha scrambled across the arena floor as the war swarm unfurled from the containment like a blooming shadow. Commander Varkle stood rigid at the control platform, his claws gripping the railing. Rhea stepped inside and paused just long enough to absorb the scene. Her gaze moved slowly across the screens, across the panicking cadets, across the swirling mass of micro-drones forming shifting tendrils of metallic dust. Her eyes focused not on the destruction, but on the patterns, how the swarm surged, paused, reoriented, then surged again. To her, the movement looked strangely familiar. The officer guiding her rushed toward the commander, speaking hurriedly. Varkle turned with irritation, ready to reprimand whoever had interrupted him at such a critical moment. Instead, he found himself staring at a human standing perfectly calmly amid chaos. Rhea smiled politely and lifted a hand in a small wave. "Cadet Rhea Benson reporting in, sir." Varkle stared at her as if he had been handed a houseplant during a live battle simulation. Before he could order her out, a sharp screech of metal echoed from the arena as the war swarm sliced through a section of debris Alpha Team had hoped to hide behind. A cascade of sparks lit the screen. Rhea's head tilted to the side. Her hand drifted to the small cylindrical object on her belt. Absent-mindedly, almost automatically. The gesture went unnoticed by everyone except Varkle, whose eyes flicked to the device. "What is that tool?" "You were not authorized to bring equipment into the observation deck," he said sharply. "Oh, this?" she asked, unclipping it. "Just something I carry around. Helps keep small animals entertained. And sometimes engineers. She pressed a button. A bright red dot appeared on the floor at her feet. Every species nearby recoiled, startled. Varkel's pupils contracted. Rhea, however, simply watched the dot for a moment, then adjusted the beam. The light danced across the glossy tiles. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, the expression of someone who had just found a familiar solution to an unfamiliar problem. She looked back at the screen. The war swarm spiraled through the air, searching for the next moving target. The corners of Rhea's eyes narrowed in thought. "Sir," she said softly, "does the swarm always respond to motion this predictably?" Commander Varkel did not answer. He stared at the red dot, then at her, then at the monstrous shifting cloud on the arena feed. Something in his instincts told him two things at once. This human was entirely unprepared, and this human was about to do something that no one in the galaxy had ever considered. The war swarm's movement intensified, fracturing into long metallic tendrils that lashed across the arena like the arms of a creature made of light and razor dust. Combat Group Alpha scattered in a chaotic burst, sprinting toward the nearest fragments of cover. Sparks rained down as one tendril sliced through a collapsed support beam. Another coiled like a serpent preparing to strike. Panic rippled through the observation deck, a wave of choked gasps and frantic whispers. Rhea did not join the noise. She watched the screen with unwavering focus, her eyes tracking the swarm's shifting forms as if she were studying the natural flow of water. Commander Varkel should have been shouting orders. He should have been triggering backup containment. Instead, he stood frozen, his attention locked on the small device in Rhea's hand. The crimson dot glowed softly on the floor next to her boot, pulsing faintly as her fingers rolled the button. The other cadets, still staring at the chaos below, had not yet noticed the connection forming silently in the space between the red dot and Rhea's steady gaze. Then something subtle changed in the arena. The swarm twitched. It paused mid-strike, its dust-like surface shivering as if some invisible hand had brushed across it. A filament of the cloud broke formation and drifted upward, tilting ever so slightly toward the observation deck. The cadets nearest the glass recoiled as the metallic particles elongated into a needle-sharp shape, as if scenting movement that did not belong to the arena's occupants. Rhea's red dot shifted slightly as she adjusted her grip. The swarm pivoted. It was small at first, almost imperceptible, an alignment of tens of billions of microdrones responding to some unexpected signal. One instructor rushed to the console. "Commander, the swarm is deviating. It is attempting to track something outside the arena." Varkel snapped out of his paralysis and slammed his hand against the railing, forcing himself back into command mode. "Identify the stimulus," he barked. "Check for unauthorized tech. Scrub electromagnetic noise." The instructor worked frantically, hands flicking across the controls. No breaches detected, no energy fluctuations beyond expected parameters. The swarm is responding to... He stopped. His face went pale beneath his exoskeletal plates. A visual signal. Varkel whipped his head toward Rhea. She blinked. "What?" she asked softly. "Do not activate anything without authorization," he snapped. "I didn't," she said. "I'm just observing." Her thumb brushed the side of the metal cylinder. The dot brightened for a fraction of a second. The swarm reacted instantly. On the screen, the immense cloud rippled downward like a collapsing wave, assembling itself into a narrow spear of swirling particles pointed directly upward toward the observation deck. Alpha Team used the brief distraction to scramble behind a slab of scorched alloy, gasping through their comlinks. Yet the swarm did not follow them. It hovered in place, trembling with a strange, anticipatory vibration. Rhea leaned closer to the glass. "It wants motion," she whispered. Varkel's clawed hand reached out and grabbed her shoulder. "Do not move," he hissed. His voice carried the strain of someone who had stared death in the face too many times. "That thing reacts to signals even its creators did not understand. If you provoke it—" "I'm not provoking it," she said calmly. "I'm testing something. You are not authorized to test anything." "Then you should authorize it," she replied without raising her voice. He stared at her as if she had just suggested pacifying a neutron bomb by humming at it. Rhea stepped forward anyway. The room seemed to tighten around her, dozens of cadets instinctively pressing back from the barrier as if the human had suddenly become more dangerous than the swarm. On the arena feed, the cloud narrowed into a sharp, quivering dagger of metallic dust. Rhea raised the cylinder and pointed the beam toward the far wall of the observation deck. A bright red dot appeared on the smooth surface. Every species in the room held its breath. The war swarm lunged. It shot upward with liquid speed, its entire body reshaping into a single cohesive ribbon of micro-drones. It slammed against the interior of the arena's upper containment field with a hiss like superheated sand. The barrier flared white, the deck lights flickered, cadets screamed, but the containment held. Varkle spun to his console. "Increase upper field strength," he shouted. "Reinforce all layers." Energy surged through the arena lattice. The swarm recoiled slightly, then continued to press against the barrier, its entire attention locked on the moving red dot Rhea now dragged slowly across the wall. Its motions were precise, reactive, hungry. Not for flesh. Rhea realized that. Not for heat, not for signals. For movement, for contrast, for something to chase. "It's no different from a training drone," she said under her breath. "Just more aggressive." Varkle whirled toward her. "More aggressive? Cadet, that thing has raised moons." "And some dogs have chewed through engine cables," she said. "Point remains." He stared at her in disbelief. "This is not comparable." "No," she agreed. "It's smarter." She flicked the beam slightly. The dot darted across the wall. The swarm slammed into the containment again, following it with frightening speed. Instructors scrambled to adjust power output as the chamber vibrated with each impact. The cadets backed farther away from the glass, watching the human with a mixture of terror and fascination. Rhea's mind, however, was quiet, focused. She was analyzing the swarm the same way she had once analyzed malfunctioning robotics back home. She noted how quickly it accelerated, how it hesitated before shifting direction, how it redistributed its mass when targeting something small and precise. She placed her free hand on the glass, leaning closer to study its reaction. Varkle slapped the emergency lock on the barrier. "Step away now." "I'm fine," she said. "You are not fine. You are attempting to interact with the most lethal autonomous construct in known space." "I know." "Then why are you still—" "Because it's working." The words landed like a stun pulse. The instructors turned toward her with slow, horrified realization. Rhea pointed the beam downward. The swarm followed, compressing itself into a tight vortex as it spiraled toward the arena floor. She dragged the dot left. The vortex veered left. She flicked it right. The swarm snapped sideways like a whip, colliding with a wall so hard that the containment field flared red. The entire arena trembled. Alpha Team huddled behind cover, stunned into silence as the weapon meant to destroy them now entirely ignored them. One cadet whispered, "What is that human doing?" Rhea exhaled slowly. "It's simple," she murmured. "It's a coordinated particle intelligence, high visual prioritization, predictable pursuit triggers." Varkle swallowed hard. His voice dropped to a near growl. "You speak as if this is a toy." Rhea shook her head. "Not a toy." She lifted the beam. The swarm lifted with it, ascending smoothly, waiting for the next motion. A very, very bored creature. Every cadet in the observation deck stared at her in absolute disbelief. The swarm hovered in perfect stillness, its entire mass suspended like a poised predator awaiting instruction. Rhea rolled the button once more. The red dot glowed brighter, bright enough for the swarm to quiver with anticipation. And in that moment, the entire Galactic Academy witnessed something no record in the galaxy's long history had ever shown. The war swarm waited for a human to play with it. Rhea lifted the red dot a few centimeters higher, and the war swarm rose with it in a smooth, eager curve, its mass rippling like liquid metal under starlight. Every eye in the observation deck tracked the movement, but no one breathed loudly enough to break the fragile silence. Commander Varkel's claws dug into the railing so hard that the metal creaked. She had stepped into the center of a moment that should not have been possible. She had crossed a boundary that no scientist, no general, no ancient warlord had ever dared to test, and she looked calm, curious, almost relaxed. She studied the swarm's behavior with the steady focus of someone adjusting fine machinery. The micro-drones clustered so tightly that they looked like a single shimmering creature, elongated into a funnel shape, its point fixed on the wall where the laser dot glowed. She flicked her wrist gently. The dot darted several meters to the left. The swarm lunged, instantly, violently, beautifully. It crashed against the containment field in a spiraling strike that would have shredded a battleship's hull if not for the reinforced barrier. Sparks of photonic energy shot outward. Power levels spiked. The containment groaned. Gasps erupted across the deck. Rhea did not flinch. She merely shifted the dot again. The swarm slammed into the next point with the same hypnotic obedience. The instructors scrambled around Varkel, shouting numbers and warnings. Upper field integrity at 64%. Secondary grid is overheating. Redirect power from Sector Gamma. We cannot let it maintain this level of impact. Commander, we must shut the trial down. Varkel snapped orders back with cold precision, but Rhea barely registered the noise. She kept her eyes on the swarm, guiding it in small arcs, never letting it strike too hard in the same place. She was learning its rhythm, testing reaction times, estimating its anticipation range. It behaved like a predator conditioned to chase, but with none of the unpredictability of biological instincts. It moved with algorithmic hunger, pure distilled pursuit logic. A machine interested in play, she thought. A terrifying thought. Yet also strangely elegant. She shifted the dot farther, creating a slow circular path. The swarm followed in a smooth whirl, tracing her orbit like a tethered comet. Cadets who had been shaking moments earlier now stared in stunned awe. Some forgot to blink. Others whispered things like prayers or curses. Rhea wasn't listening. She was calculating. How responsive is it to depth? She murmured quietly, almost to herself. She directed the dot downward, letting it travel along the arena floor via the screen's projection. The floor sensors detected the dot and translated it into the holographic overlay used for tactical analysis. The swarm dove, reshaping itself mid-flight into a tight sphere before spreading outward like a fan. Particles at the edges trailed behind like mist. Interesting, Rhea whispered. It compresses to increase accuracy but expands for speed. Varkel turned toward her sharply. Stop speaking as if you are dissecting a specimen. You are tempting something that should never respond to a living being. She did not look at him. I'm not tempting it, Commander. I'm directing it. That is precisely what terrifies me. Before Rhea could answer, a cluster of micro-drones broke formation and drifted closer to the barrier, shimmering like drops of silver drifting up a window. She noticed instantly. Ah, she said softly. So it wants a closer signal. She moved the dot upward across the ceiling of the observation deck. The tiny cluster rejoined the main body, and the entire swarm surged upward again, following the light with coordinated hunger. The ceiling containment flashed bright white, drawing pained winces from the watchers. Do not send it into the upper barrier again, an instructor shouted. The heat regulators will fail. Rhea lowered the dot gently, slipping it toward the far corner of the arena floor. The swarm plunged after it, leaving the barrier intact. The containment grid dimmed, stabilizing. A wave of relieved exhalations passed through the deck. But their relief was nothing compared to the sudden dawning realization spreading through the crowd. This human was not in danger. This human was in control. Rhea leaned closer to the glass. Her voice was soft, thoughtful, almost soothing. "It's learning my pacing. If I move too quickly, it overshoots. If I move too slowly, it compresses too tightly. But if I move at just the right tempo, it stays perfectly balanced." She tested that theory: small curves, smooth arcs, a gentle zigzag. The swarm followed with deadly precision, but no aggression. There was no attempt to break formation, no sign of independent attack patterns. It had become a singular, obedient organism chasing the motion she defined. Commander Varkle felt cold down to the deepest plate of his armored scales. He took a single step toward her. "Cadet," he said, voice low and dark, "you must hand me that device, immediately." Rhea finally turned her head, her expression puzzled. "Why? It's working." "That is why," he growled. "Something this dangerous should not respond to something this simple." "Honestly, Commander," she said, "that explains a lot about why no one has tamed it before." His jaw clenched. "This is not humor." "Neither is this," she replied. She pointed the dot upward suddenly, higher than before. The swarm shot upward, but she redirected again before it hit the barrier. The swarm twisted in mid-flight, redirecting itself in a spiral that resembled a corkscrew of glittering dust. The containment grid dimmed again, spared another surge of impact. Several instructors stared at the display in disbelief. "She is predicting its movement ahead of time," one whispered. "She is compensating faster than our simulations." "She is improvising," Varkle said bitterly. "Humans improvise in ways no one can predict." "Commander," another instructor said, voice shaking, "she is making it dance." The next motion proved him right. Rhea drew a slow, sweeping loop across the far wall. The swarm followed in an elegant arc, its mass shimmering like a ribbon caught in a gravitational wave. She drew another loop. The swarm mirrored it. She crossed the loops, creating a twisting pattern like a figure 8. The swarm wove through it flawlessly. A murmur of pure disbelief rippled through the deck. Cadets who once trembled now leaned forward, mesmerized. The weapon that had ended empires danced through the air like a trained aerial creature responding to a handler's commands. But Rhea did not smile. She was not playing. She was probing, testing boundaries, examining behavior. She lowered the dot sharply, bouncing it across 2 different surfaces. "It has edge threshold sensitivity," she murmured. "Prefers uninterrupted motion." She flicked the dot farther than before, near the arena's far corner. The swarm followed. Then she whispered one more observation, not to Varkle, not to the instructors, but to herself. "It's not hunting me at all. It's hunting the idea of motion. That means it's not prioritizing biological signatures. It's prioritizing patterns." She glanced toward Varkle then, her face a mix of wonder and seriousness that unsettled him more than fear ever could. "Commander," she said quietly, "I think this thing wants a hierarchy. Not destruction, not territory. It wants instruction, purpose, direction." "You cannot possibly know that," Varkle said. "I can," Rhea said, turning the laser off. The red dot vanished. The entire swarm froze mid-air, in absolute stillness, as if waiting, as if suspended between breaths. Every cadet in the observation deck went silent. Even the hum of the machinery around them seemed to hold its breath. Rhea slowly raised the cylinder again. She clicked the beam on. The red dot reappeared 3 meters to the left. The swarm lunged for it instantly, not randomly, not violently, with focus, with discipline, and with the unmistakable expression, not of a weapon acting on pure instinct, but of a creature awaiting its handler's next command. Rhea exhaled softly, whispering words that made Commander Varkle's blood chill. "It's not wild," she said. "It's just been waiting for someone to tell it what to do." For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch across every nervous system in the observation deck, the galaxy's worst weapon moved like a trained pet chasing a dot on the floor. Then the moment shattered. "Cut the trial!" one of the instructors screamed, voice cracking. "Shut it down before it penetrates the upper grid!" Hands flew across consoles. Warning sigils flared along the edges of the arena projection. Automated voiceovers began reciting emergency protocols in a dozen languages at once. Commander Varkel's hand hovered over the hardwired failsafe that would flood the chamber with enough heat to turn the war swarm into incandescent mist. He did not press it. His eyes remained fixed on Rhea. She stood a half step from the glass, one hand braced lightly against it, the other holding the tiny cylinder that had turned a nightmare into an obedient storm. She shifted the dot once more, this time not in a playful loop, but in a short, straight line that traced a path away from Combat Group Alpha and toward an empty section of the arena floor. The swarm followed without hesitation. Alpha's panicked comm chatter filled the audio feed. The cadets had stopped running. Some peeked out from behind cover, staring in disbelief at the swirling cloud that no longer paid any attention to them. Varkel forced his voice to steady. "Alpha Team," he said through the arena channel, "you will remain under cover and cease all movement. Do not attempt to engage. Do not fire. Do not interfere." A bewildered reply crackled back. "Commander, what is—" "That is an order," he snapped. Silence answered him, then a strained, "Yes, Commander." Rhea heard the exchange distantly, as if through water. Her attention was locked on the way the swarm adjusted its patterns every time she moved the light. At one point, a small wedge of micro-drones drifted out of cohesion, hesitating between the last point and the new one. Rhea slowed her motion, letting the stragglers catch up. The cloud reformed into a tight, unified mass. "Good," she whispered, as if soothing a restless animal. "You do not like losing pieces." Varkel stepped closer to her. "What are you doing now?" he asked, careful to keep his tone level. "Establishing consistency," she said. "If I want it to accept a new command structure, it has to trust one signal first. Otherwise, it will react to everything as equal stimulus." "Trust," he repeated incredulously. "You are speaking about trust with a weapon that dismantled orbital cities." "It dismantled those," she said, "because someone told it to, or failed to tell it anything else." She slid the dot to the very center of the arena and let it rest there. The swarm converged to that point and hovered above the light in a perfectly symmetrical sphere, layers of micro-drones rotating around one another in smooth, concentric shells. It looked almost tranquil, in a way that sent a chill down every spine that watched. Then, for the first time since the disaster weapon had been uncovered by the Academy's predecessors, the arena readings reported something that did not fit any of the expected behavior models. The swarm stabilized. No active hunt patterns, no expansion, no autonomous probing. It waited. "Commander," an instructor said hoarsely, "the activity map is flattening. It is not searching. It is not optimizing new attack vectors. It is simply holding pattern." Rhea nodded slightly. She paused, corrected herself. "It is." She drew in a slow breath and clicked the pointer off. The red dot vanished. The swarm began to tremble, particles shifting, cohesion loosening at the edges as the default routines stirred back to life. Before the weapon could slip into independent action, Rhea pressed the button again. This time she did not point the beam at the wall or the floor. She angled it carefully, letting the dot land dead center on the containment sphere's interior surface, exactly where the swarm had originally been housed. The cloud recoiled, then poured itself toward the old cage like liquid mercury being drawn back into a mold. Gasps ricocheted across the deck. Varkel stared in stunned silence as the war swarm streamed into the sphere, compressing itself into a compact, pulsating mass that wrapped itself around the glowing dot. The containment field readings stabilized. Energy levels dropped. Alarm sigils on the consoles began to blink yellow instead of red. "Is it returning to storage?" an instructor whispered. "Yes," another answered in disbelief. "Voluntarily." Rhea waited until the last trailing filament of micro-drones vanished inside the sphere. Then she slowly dimmed the dot, rolling the power down until only the faintest ghost of red remained, just enough to hold the weapon's focus. She turned her head toward Varkel. Her voice came out steady, but her fingers shook just enough that he noticed. "Now you can end the trial, Commander," she said. He realized he was still standing over the failsafe. For the first time in many years, he did not know which was more dangerous, pressing it or trusting what he had just seen. He swallowed once, then spoke aloud. "End trial. Seal containment. Lock the sphere into triple redundancy. I want every auxiliary field online." The arena lights shifted to a soft, neutral white. The automated voice recited the formal closure sequence. "War Swarm trial terminated. Containment secured. Combat Group Alpha. Remain in the arena until extraction protocols are complete." Hysterical laughter broke out over the comm feed from one of the Alpha cadets. Another voice muttered something that sounded suspiciously like gratitude directed at an unknown human. On the observation deck, the silence was heavier than any alarm. Rhea finally switched the pointer off. The red dot disappeared. Inside the sphere, the swarm compressed into a dense, nearly opaque ball, then settled into what the diagnostic overlay described with chilling simplicity. Dormant. Rhea let her hand drop to her side. The cylinder felt suddenly heavier. She unclipped it and placed it carefully on the nearest console, as if leaving a dangerous tool where everyone could see it. Varkle stared at the device, then at her. "What exactly," he said slowly, "did you bring into my academy, Cadet Benson?" She followed his gaze and gave a slightly sheepish smile. "A laser pointer," she said, "technically intended for bored pets, stubborn machinery, and co-workers during long meetings." He blinked, as if his mind refused to accept the words. Around them, cadets finally began to murmur, as if someone had lifted a weight from their throats. The whispers carried a single word over and over in different accents and tones. Human. Human did that. Of course it was a human. Rhea shifted her weight uneasily. "For the record," she added, "I did not intend to reprogram your doomsday relic on my first day. I just recognized a familiar pattern response." Varkle's lips peeled back from his teeth in something that was not quite a snarl and not quite a smile. "Cadet," he said, "you have just altered the strategic considerations of half the known galaxy with a pocket trinket." "That seems like an exaggeration," she said. "It is not." He turned toward the assembled cadets, his voice snapping into command tone. "All of you listen," he said. "Recordings of this trial will be classified under the highest security protocols. You will not speak of what you have seen here outside authorized debriefings. You will not speculate on external channels. The existence of a handler, of any handler, for the war swarm is information that must be contained until the Academy understands what it means." Dozens of faces turned from the now quiet sphere to the slight human standing near the railing. Rhea could feel the weight of their attention settling on her skin. For the first time since she had stepped off the shuttle, she looked less like a traveler passing through and more like someone who had wandered onto a stage by accident. "Commander," one cadet called out, "what does this make her?" Varkle did not answer immediately. He studied Rhea's posture, the way she carried herself, the calm that had begun to fracture now that the adrenaline was draining out of her system. Her fingers still trembled faintly. Her breathing had deepened. The bravado, if there had ever been any, had evaporated. What remained was someone who understood what she had touched, not power, responsibility. "Her," Varkle said at last, "is now the only being in this academy who the swarm has chosen to respond to without trying to annihilate everything in sight. That makes her—" He let the words settle into the stunned silence. "The first war swarm handler." The title rippled through the room like a shockwave. Rhea grimaced slightly. "That sounds like something out of a bad recruitment poster," she muttered. One corner of Varkle's mouth twitched. "I do not write the posters," he said. "I only train those foolish enough to appear on them." He signaled to the officer who had escorted Rhea earlier. "Escort Cadet Benson to a secure briefing room," he ordered. "No one else is to approach her until she has been debriefed. That includes curious cadets and overeager scientists." The officer nodded sharply. Understood, Commander. Rhea hesitated, glancing back at the containment sphere. She felt almost absurdly guilty, as if she were leaving an excited animal locked in a cage after promising a walk. Commander, she said quietly, you should keep a simple visual lure active at all times, even a low-powered one. Otherwise, it will get bored and start searching for its own stimuli again. You are telling me how to care for my own apocalypse, he said dryly. Yes, she answered, because if you do not, you will have another incident. And next time, I might not be on the observation deck. He considered that, eyes narrowing. Then he nodded once. We will design a non-portable equivalent. In the meantime, no one touches your device. She exhaled in relief. Good. I like that one. The officer gestured toward the exit. Rhea followed, feeling the gaze of every cadet on her back as she left the deck. News of the trial's outcome spread faster than any encryption protocol could contain. By the time Rhea finished an exhaustive debrief involving senior tacticians, xenopsychologists, and 3 separate security councils, unofficial stories were already mutating across the Academy's subnets. In some versions, she had wrestled the swarm with psychic powers. In others, she had arrived with secret human military technology. One rumor insisted she had bribed the swarm with entangled particles from a collapsed star. Only a handful of officials knew the truth. A bored human, a cheap pointer, an old weapon that recognized at last someone who spoke its language of motion and focus. In the weeks that followed, the Academy did not cancel the War Swarm program. Instead, it changed it. The swarm's containment sphere was moved to a new chamber reinforced with additional fields and layered observation windows. Access was restricted. Protocols were rewritten with one new category: handler authorization required. Rhea found herself assigned to a schedule that looked nothing like a normal cadet's. Some days she attended standard tactical courses, stumbling through alien martial drills like any other newcomer. Other days she entered the swarm chamber alone, a dozen cameras trained on her, while she guided the metallic cloud through elaborate patterns. Circles, spirals, figure eights, obstacle courses made of hardened alloys that she taught it to weave through without touching, static decoy targets that she directed it to avoid. She discovered quickly that the swarm understood negative commands as well as positive ones. If she consistently moved the dot away from a forbidden area, it began to anticipate the off-limits zone and route itself around without prompting. Obedience, not malice, she wrote in one of the research logs. It has never been wild, only unsupervised. Sometimes, when she was alone with it, she spoke to it as if it were listening with more than its visual processing arrays. You are more than what someone coded you for, she would say quietly, watching the cloud glide in smooth arcs. You can be dangerous without being a disaster. It never answered, of course. It only followed the light, but it always followed her light. Outside the chamber, debates erupted in quiet rooms. Some admirals demanded the swarm be weaponized under tight human supervision. Others argued it should be dismantled at any cost, before news of a handler leaked and every faction in the galaxy began hunting for her. A few cooler-headed strategists suggested something more radical: reclassification, not as a weapon, as a living system. Not alive in a biological sense, but possessed of behavior that straddled the line between programming and instinct. If it could learn patterns, respond to consistent discipline, accept boundaries, then it could be integrated, not as a sword, but as a shield. Rhea submitted her own recommendation, written in neat handwriting on an old-fashioned physical pad. Use it as perimeter defense, she suggested. Teach it to chase specific visual keys that only our ships can project. Teach it to ignore anything else unless given an override command. It will never be safe, but it can be safer. Like training a lightning storm to strike only decoys. Varkle read her report in silence. He did not like the idea of relying on something that had nearly killed him in his youth. But he trusted what he had seen. The war swarm did not obey the Academy. The war swarm obeyed Rhea. Months passed. She rose through the ranks not because of her test scores, those were respectable but not legendary, but because every time she entered the swarm chamber, the metallic storm settled into calm, precise patterns. Instructors began to bring senior cadets to observe her sessions. "You will never control it," Varkle would tell them. "You will only learn how someone else does. That is important. Not every battlefield advantage belongs to you personally. Sometimes your survival will depend on trusting the right fool." He never specified whether Rhea was that fool. He did not need to. One quiet rotation, after a particularly complex training sequence in which she had guided the swarm through a three-dimensional maze without a single containment field flicker, Varkle waited for her outside the chamber. She stepped out looking exhausted yet content, her pointer clipped back to her belt. "Well?" he asked. "She did well," Rhea said, then corrected herself with a faint laugh. "It did well. Sorry. Habit." "You are giving it a gender now?" he asked dryly. "I am trying not to," she said. "The research team gets nervous when I anthropomorphize the apocalyptic murder cloud." Her words, not mine. He snorted. "What do you think of it now, Handler?" She thought about that for a moment. "I think," she said slowly, "that we were wrong to believe it was pure destruction. It is pure response. That is not the same. We built something that cannot say no, so someone has to say no for it. And that someone is you," Varkle said. "For now," she agreed, "until we build better layers between it and the rest of the galaxy, or until we retire it somewhere quiet with an endless wall to chase dots on." He considered her words. "You would put the most dangerous construct in known space in a pasture," he said. "In a heavily armored pasture," she replied, "with strong fences and good caretakers." "Caretakers," he echoed. "Handlers," she corrected. "Plural. I do not want to be the only one forever." That, more than anything, reassured him. Power sought monopoly. Responsibility sought successors. The Academy never did release the full details of that first trial to the public. Officially, the war swarm remained an uncontrollable relic, restrained under the most secure conditions. Unofficially, within the highest circles, a new strategic line appeared on quiet reports. Asset, war swarm. Status, tamed under handler supervision. Years later, when cadets whispered about the day the war swarm almost broke free during Alpha's trial, the story always came with embellishments. In some versions, Rhea had walked straight into the arena and stood beneath the swirling cloud as it spun overhead without touching her. In others, she had turned the swarm on an invading force single-handedly. Only those who had stood on that observation deck remembered the simple truth. A human had seen a pattern where others had seen only horror. A human had offered the weapon something it had never been given before: consistent direction. And the weapon had chosen to follow. Rhea never claimed ownership of it. In every report, in every debrief, she made the same point. "The war swarm is not mine," she wrote. "It is under my care. That is different." In time, the Academy built protocols, safeguards, and a new division dedicated to managing humanity's strangest partnership. Rhea trained others to use similar devices, teaching them hand positions, timings, and the calm state of mind required to guide a storm without flinching. Some handlers struggled, some quit, some succeeded. The swarm learned the subtle differences between each of them, but it always reacted with particular precision when Rhea entered the chamber. Perhaps that was only familiarity, or perhaps the first hand that offered purpose leaves a trace, even in a machine. On the day she finally stepped away from active duty, older, sharper, and carrying more scars than she had arrived with, Rhea walked to the containment window alone. Inside, the war swarm rotated in a slow, intricate spiral, responding to a wall-mounted projector that traced steady, looping paths across the internal surfaces. No chaos, no wild surges, just a restless intelligence, given something to do. She lifted her hand to the glass in a quiet farewell. "Stay busy," she murmured. "Stay focused. Stay where you are meant to be." The cloud shifted, tightening its spiral for a moment, as if acknowledging the presence on the other side of the barrier. Rhea smiled once, then turned and walked away. Behind her, the galaxy's most terrifying weapon continued to chase the light projected within its cage, obedient to patterns someone had finally thought to teach it. It would defend worlds now under careful command. It would guard stations. It would never again be unleashed without purpose. No empire would wield it alone. No mad architect would whisper new ruin into its code. The swarm had a handler. The academy had a safeguard. And the galaxy, for once, had taken something born for war and given it something else instead. Rules, boundaries, and just enough play to keep the darkness from reaching beyond the glass.